and welcome to another Radical long form podcast with me, the Radical Majid Nawaz. Today, we are honored to be hosting our guest, author of The Case for American Power. Here is his book. Yes, that is Shadi Hamid, Egyptian American author, who has written this book articulating the case for American power at a very and incredibly timely, turbulent time when it comes to geopolitics and the role of the United States. So, without further ado, for our premium radical subscribers, we welcome Shadi Hamid. And Shadi, if you can hear us, welcome to the Radical Form podcast. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Majid. Thanks so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm holding up your book here, The Case for American Power. When I first saw through the socials that you'd written this book, I was very excited to read it. As I've mentioned to you, I did so over the Christmas holiday period just gone. That's December 2025, and did so in the home of my in-laws, who happen to be from Tennessee. Because though we live in London, married to an American girl from Tennessee. We in fact got married there in Nashville. So I was in particular because of that. Our son has been born, by the way, in the state of Tennessee. He was born there first, then we brought him here to live with us in London. So because of that and personal connection and my history and relationship with you, I was very interested to read this book and discuss it with you. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us here today on the Radical Form podcast, Shadi.
Yeah, thank you, Majid.
I thought we'd begin by just going through some of your previous titles, because I found upon reading this, similar to my own background, you came to the topic of the role of American power on the world stage by having to kind of reflect and reconcile your own presence in America, in your case in the US, in my case generally more in a Western sense, being from the UK. But the similar age and the similar formative experiences we had, in particular post 9/11, that you mention in the introduction of this book, shaped inevitably your worldview and your outlook, and shaped the American Egyptian Muslim, openly and proudly Muslim American Egyptian that we see in front of us, and who is speaking to us today. So some of your past titles reflect that formative
Hmm.
journey. We've got, for example, some of your previous books you've mentioned in the beginning of this one. Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World. Uh, Another one, Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East. Another one, a third one, Rethinking Political Islam with William McCants. And another one, Militants, Criminals and Warlords, The Challenge of Local Governance in an Age of Disorder. And finally, The Problem of Democracy, America and the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea. Now, anyone who knows anything about me, at least, will know the sorts of books I would have eaten for breakfast with you, and very similar journeys ourselves. So talk to me a bit about your formative period, and if you can, in a kind of synopsis, these past books as well. I know there's a lot there, but just how it shaped you, how the past titles are perhaps reflective of the Shadi we see in front of us, and then ultimately to this book and how you ended up here.
Yeah, so I think we can start with 9/11. It was a formative moment for me. I was a freshman in college. It happened 2 weeks in. I was trying to figure out who I was and who I wanted to be. It was that kind of identity crisis time that a lot of us face. And then 9/11 happens, and it forces me to rethink a lot of my assumptions. It politicizes me. Maybe in some ways, it even radicalizes me a little bit. I became a kind of pseudo socialist, anti imperialist. I thought that everything was America's fault. I blamed America first. And I think for a good reason. I mean, America at that time was doing a lot of destructive things. Of course, the Iraq War is paramount in that story, and I kind of cut my political chops as an anti-war activist at that time. And so I was organizing a lot. I was one of those guys with the signs outside the White House. But I mean, the question that 9/11 raised for me is maybe some of the standard questions that a lot of us are familiar with, which is, why do they hate us? How could something like 9/11 possibly happen? And why was there so much extremism and chaos in the Middle East? That was the kind of puzzling thing for me. And I wanted to understand, how had the Middle East become like this? And one of the answers that I reached was, It was partly because of American foreign policy that America had supported brutal dictatorships throughout the Middle East, and I sort of had a sense of that. I would spend my summers in Egypt. That's where my parents are from, and I would always wonder, why was there this dictator, Hosni Mubarak, who was in power for 30 years? Why was he always there? And so that was a mystery. The US supports democracy in theory, but we don't support democracy in practice, at least not in the Middle East. And so why, right? And part of the explanation is that we're afraid of who might come to power through free elections. We have a fear of elections in the Middle East. And that's because the parties that are most likely to win are Islamist parties. And that's why, as you noted, several of my previous books have to do with this question of political Islam. And so when I talk about Islamist parties, I'm thinking about groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Jordan. There are Islamist parties in Morocco and Algeria. I mean, across the region, you have the most prominent opposition groups having this religious orientation. And we as Americans were uncomfortable with that because we think that if elections are held, liberals should win, the people who are most like us. And then we get very confused when people who aren't like us win time and time again. So I wanted to understand, who are these Islamist parties? What animates them? What do they believe in? Should we be so fearful of them? And my answer has been, we don't have to like them, but we have to understand them. We don't have to like them, but they do have a right to participate in the political process. They do have a right to contest elections. That's what democracy is about, right? Democracy is the right to make the wrong choice. That's often how I define it. And God knows, I mean, in America, we've made the wrong choice, at least in my view, several times voting for Donald Trump. So why shouldn't other countries also have the right to do that?
In that formative journey, um, a lot of that is shaped by the personal, and you mentioned a lot of the personal, how it came to the fore after 9/11, and questions of identity revolved around that. And you mentioned the anti-war movement, the progressive side of that reflection of identity. So you were drawn to a lot of the progressive politics. That's no secret.
Yeah.
And I've known that of you for many years as well. You ended up in the think tank world prior to becoming an author, didn't you? Was it Brookings, if I recall
Yeah, I was
correctly?
at the Brookings Institution for about 14 years, so quite a long time.
So people can position that, especially in the European context, though of course we have a lot of American listeners too and viewers. But for those on the European side, Brookings, for a long time, and stop me if I'm unfairly characterizing it, but for a long time, I'd say was recognized as the premium liberal think tank in DC that set and defined the tone of the Obama years. Is that correct? Is that fair?
Yeah, to some extent, yeah. I mean, there were definitely disagreements between many of us at Brookings and Barack Obama, but I would say overall, Brookings is center left establishment.
Mm. And where would you now, because you mentioned the journey you've gone through in terms of the anti-war progressive side and how your reflections around American power and its role in the world have evolved by sort of how the world has been changing. So where does that journey politically land you today? I mean, we've mentioned Brookings, we've mentioned the kind of ideological leanings that perhaps have moderated somewhat since your youth. But if you were to look at the mosaic today, you've said you're not a fan of Trump, but if you were to look at the mosaic today, where would your views be situated in the most reasonable kind of?
Yeah,
I
sure.
know it's difficult to do, but
No, I'll try. So, if you had talked to me maybe 5 years ago, I would have said that I was more heterodox around the center, that I was moving away from the progressive movement because I thought progressives had become too woke. I was a woke skeptic. Some people would even describe me as anti woke, although I don't love that phrase. But I thought there was a lot of excess in that time around this obsession with white supremacy. Everything is systemic racism, obsessions around gender identity and sexual identity, and kind of imposing that on Americans and saying there's only one way to think about these issues. And if you don't agree, then you're anti-trans or you're racist or God knows what else you are. And there was a lot of cancel culture around that time, and that really put me off. But I think that wokeness has essentially been defeated, so it's no longer the defining issue in American politics. And what's taken its place, at least on the left side of the spectrum, is Gaza and the Palestinian plight and cause. And that's where I've sort of returned to the progressive fold. And I'm more comfortable saying now that I'm a progressive who is aligned in some ways with people like Bernie Sanders, AOC, or Zoran Mamdani. I would say that I'm a little bit more culturally conservative than they are, but at least when it comes to, because Gaza has been so important and it's almost become a litmus test if you're on the left side of the spectrum. And Gaza has become, in addition to 9/11, maybe the second formative moment for me. I think it is the moral crisis of our time, the moral question of our time. And so I look for politicians who are on the right side of that question, and I identify with them. Um, and I generally vote for the Democratic Party. In fact, I think I've always voted for the Democratic Party. I sometimes have to hold my nose. So in 2024, with Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, that was a game time decision for me. I walked into um, the ballot the booth the ballot booth or whatever you call it, and I wasn't sure what I would do, but I decided to vote for Kamala because it was like a lesser of two evils sort of thing. And I was just so frightened of what Donald Trump would bring us, but I was very angry at Kamala too, in part because of her positions on Gaza. And she was also just a very uninspiring candidate. And the fact that Democrats put forward time and time again candidates who are just so disappointing, of course, that makes me a Democrat who's critical of the Democratic Party. Let's put it that way.
So this is one of the reasons I knew I liked you when I first met you many years ago. The woke stuff you've just talked about, you may or may not know, but I've been of a similar vein.
Yeah.
My listeners certainly do know, and my viewers. That's something which, again, I very much agree with you on, actually, and also sympathize with you on, because for a while it was difficult for people of your background and position, the Brookings background, I mean here, the political side especially, but also being from a ethnic minority background, it was difficult to hold that line on the woke topic for a period because it was seen as somehow treacherous to the community,
Yes.
because of the overall wider alliances that were needed. So I fully am on board with you on that. And one of the reasons, as I've said, I respect you and liked you when we met many years ago. Um, where we perhaps diverge on is on some of the conclusions around who was best to resolve the Gaza issue. But like you, that became a very important issue for me. And I looked at the Muslims in Michigan and how they backed Trump to stop the war and saw Biden as somebody that was prolonging it. But that's not really the topic of today, but just a kind of
Yeah.
position where
Sure.
that could have gone either way. And I think in some cases with Muslims, it did. Now, the only reason I make that point is for the actual point here, which is, again, though, both you and I, in talking through that, including the areas where there's been divergence in where we landed after that, it's still very much informed, interestingly, by a Muslim lens. You and I both said, look, Gaza has got to be one of the important subjects that guides who we look at to stop that situation in the upcoming US election. It just so happened, I thought, along with the Muslims in the key swing state of Michigan, that Trump was going to stop it first. But the conclusion isn't really my question
Mm.
here. The issue is that we were using the same lens. And very interestingly, in that way, our perhaps unique cultural formative identity is inseparable from the framework that we use to look at morality and the moral good and how and where we'd like to place our votes.
I think that's right. And I would say, and people accuse me sometimes of being a kind of Muslim identitarian because they feel that so much of my politics is driven by the fact that I'm Muslim. I wouldn't want to overstate the extent, but yes, I admit being Muslim matters to me. It's an important part of my identity. And I was raised in a kind of, somewhat traditional Muslim household. Those values, I think, stay with me to this day. Um, and it was formative for me. And I think there's nothing wrong with us as American Muslims or British Muslims bringing our Islam into our public engagement, just as Christians and conservative Jews should also bring in their identities to the political process. Why should we suppress who we are or hide who we are? And I think there's been much more openness in the US. There's more of us Muslim Americans who are out there speaking and writing and being in the media. That wasn't always the case, but there's now been a lot of pushback, obviously, in America and Europe. There's a lot of Islamophobia. So that almost makes my Muslim identity become more important because people are obsessed with Islam, and we're returning to a lot of these old questions of, as you well know, Majid, does Islam belong in the West? Is there a place for us? So I think a lot of us want to kind of fight back and say, yes, of course there is a place for us. Yes, Islam can play a constructive role. Islam should not be this threat that people see as ending Western civilization. So I think a lot of these questions are going to be with us for a long time to come.
Now, this is perfectly summarized what you've just said, why I thought we needed to have this conversation. The answer you just gave, because the person who just said that Islam forms a key part of the framework and the personality, the identity through which they understand the world. And by the way, that's me too, right? The person who said that also believes in the case for American power, right? That's why it's so important we have this conversation, because I'm the British version of that, right? So I would have written a book to say why Britain is home, why it is important, and why it should have a say on the world stage. The title isn't really the issue here. It's the idea that, there is a role for Western presence in the world. And as somebody who's very proud of my Muslim identity from Britain, I think that you can see clearly why I felt it was important to have this conversation. And on that note, because you mentioned some of the woke issues. Now, again, we can say this now in hindsight, perhaps pre-COVID, an era I call BC, before COVID, but perhaps BC, this conversation, as you've alluded to in your answer, Shadi, would have been a lot harder. But I think since the woke meme, let's say, exploded, and then critiques against it became popularized, and then the dust settled, and then everybody realized that critiquing woke, which again I'm sure you'd agree is in itself is an appropriation of the original hip hop term, by the way, which didn't mean what it ended up getting appropriated to mean. It didn't mean hysterical virtual signaling about your identity, skin color, or gender, or sexuality. It didn't mean that. It meant something else, which, if you look up hip hop culture and look up the kind of critique they had against the New World Order and the way in which the dangers of state surveillance and being awake to the dangers of foreign interventionism and invading countries being tied to racial discrimination in not just domestic policy, but also foreign policy. It had a different context to how the word originally came. Nevertheless, despite the way in which that kind of settled to a point where it became acceptable to criticize woke, I think it is important that and I know this because of what you've already said to us, your reference and framing to criticize it is also informed by your slightly more social conservatism. I'm with you on that because of the Muslim identity.
Yeah.
Let me unpack that. What I mean is we've come and grown up in a fusion, no doubt, but still informed by a certain Muslim culture around us of social conservatism. We don't tend to, at least among our family and among our wider community, celebrate individual sexual promiscuity, for example. So when you look at some of the excesses in the woke that eventually became known as the excesses in the woke agenda, the whole sexualization of children and all of that, it's a no-brainer for people raised in our communities in the West to look at that and say, no, I don't want to be associated with that. So it was informed by that. And I think a lot of wider society came to appreciate where social conservatism in this context actually could, informed by a belief in God or a faith in God, could could also contribute to a greater good in a societal sense. A lot of people became more accustomed, or it became more palatable for them to kind of see a good in moral pronouncements being informed by some, or grounded in some sense of faith. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's right. That there is something about the emphasis on sexuality and gender identity that I think really rubbed people in our community the wrong way. And I think that kind of speaks to something really fundamental. How you view gender, that's how you kind of orient your worldview. Some people say, well, why is all that stuff so important? But on a kind of ontological level, the way that we understand the world around us, we have to orient ourselves to a kind of North Star. And I think religion is precisely what does that. And then when you start to feel like religious precepts are under attack, that the secular establishment just wants to dismantle the kind of foundations of your worldview, it leads you to feel very embattled. And that's why I think there has been this kind of exodus of religious folks from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And why a lot of, let's say, evangelicals, 80% plus, ended up voting for Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump isn't really even a Christian. So that leads to a kind of paradox. Why? So I think those of us on the center left or the left, we've unfortunately pushed a lot of religious conservative people away from us because we don't understand their worldview and we're not kind of bringing them into our tent. And this is why I've always argued to people in the Democratic Party, let's not make our tent so small. Let's actually widen our tent to have more people so that conservative Muslims and Arabs and evangelicals and other people of faith can really have a place in the party, which I don't think they currently do.
And I think that everything we've heard of the Shadi that makes up who you are now, with those formative background experiences and that framing, leads to the Shadi that still says, though he's a Muslim, he's Egyptian American, but he still says we need American power in the world, which brings us to the crux of the topic. Could you, for our viewers and listeners, summarize in an answer form? Again, I know you've written a whole book on it, it will be difficult, but if you can summarize in an answer form, Shadi, what is the case for American power in the world?
Sure. And I do definitely acknowledge that it seems contradictory. And that's why I wanted to write this book, because I wanted to show people that we contain multitudes. We struggle with our own. The book is a kind of anguished manifesto. I have strong opinions, but I'm also a little bit torn where I'm like, do I really believe in American power as much as I think I do? And sometimes I waver on that because of Gaza, but we can sort of unpack that. The case is this: power is a fact, someone has to wield it. And I think America is far preferable to the alternatives. And the alternatives are primarily China and Russia. But also, I think America is worth fighting for and believing in, despite the fact that, in my view, Donald Trump has tainted the idea of American power and he's become very aggressive and militaristic, especially in recent months, as we've seen. That doesn't negate the premise. The premise is that America can be a force for good in the world. And just because we've made a lot of mistakes in the past doesn't mean we're doomed to repeat them in the future. Because a lot of people will tell me, Shadi, what about all the terrible things we did in Latin America during the Cold War? What about all the terrible things we've done in the Middle East over the last 2 decades? And I'll actually acknowledge a lot of that. We do have a very checkered history, but that doesn't mean that we should give up on the American project. So this is a kind of call to arms, especially to young people, to progressives, to my fellow Arab and Muslim Americans, or Arabs and Muslims anywhere really, to say that America still holds promise. And here are the reasons why. And one of the reasons is America is one of the few countries in the world that is founded on a distinct moral mission. We are an ideological country, and I'm not using ideological in a pejorative sense. I mean that in a more positive sense, that we have a set of ideas that we subscribe to. And everyone who is American or born in America understands that there's something special about the American identity. And we do want to share our values with most of the world. The problem is we don't live up to those ideals. So I want to close the gap between ideals and reality. I want us to actually become a better country that supports democracy in the Middle East, that actually helps more Muslims abroad live lives of freedom and peace and prosperity. I don't want my fellow Egyptians to live under dictatorship for the rest of their lives. And I think American power can be a means to freeing them and freeing people who live under authoritarian rule anywhere else in the world, because we have this sense that democracy is universal. It's not just for Westerners. It's not just for Americans. It's not just for Christians. It's for everyone.
Now, again, I'd say if I were to summarize where there's agreement in everything you said, I'd say it's about 98% of what I've just heard you say. And that last 2% is what I'd like to ask you on. But it's not even a disagreement. It's more a bit like the Michigan example with the Muslims in Michigan who decided, using the same framework that I'd say you have, that what was going to stop the conflict in Gaza quicker was electing Trump and not Biden or Kamala Harris. It's more how the lens reflects the light, if you like, as opposed to the lens itself. So on your answer you've just given, let's take it onto the world stage. So I agree with you that the idealism is worth fighting for. Britain shares a lot of that idealism, clearly, and the values and the ideas that underpin that, and a lot of the cultural elements that underpin it, shape the way we, what we'd like to see in the world. I clearly and obviously, because of my history as a political prisoner in Egypt, agree with you that it's important that the tyranny, not just in Egypt, but you and I see eye to eye on Syria as well, the tyrannies, the old Ba'athist dictatorships that existed in the Arab world needed to go. However, this is where I think it gets interesting. On in your introduction, on page 9, you've written the following based upon the answer you've just given, which is as good a case as any for American power. Before I read this, I think it's also fair, by the way, to say that yes, we believe in these ideas and the values, and they should exist in the world. And hands up, they haven't been implemented, and where they haven't, that's not a case against the ideas and values. It's a case of calling out abandoning them. So that's pretty much, I think, a fair summary of why you think American power is important, because it's not that the values and the ideas and the culture isn't worth defending. It's admitting that where it hasn't been implemented, it's all the more reason to call it out, because the idea itself is worth holding on to. Now, in that vein, on page 9 of the introduction, you've written, as I will argue, our crisis is in how we interpret this reality and what we do about it, not in the reality itself. We can lament it all we like, to little avail. There is no alternative, at least not in the foreseeable future. So we have a choice. We can wring our hands and fantasize about a multipolar future that is unlikely to ever come, or we can acknowledge that American power itself is not the problem. Pax Americana has, on balance, been good for the world, better than any previous empire, and certainly better than any conceivable alternative in the present. Again, agree.
Wow.
Agreed. This is also very similar to how I view democracy, by the way, which I know you've addressed in the book and gone back to Plato in talking about. It's a very similar theme. That is that democracy is the worst. A bad system, but the best of the bad systems that we have out there. So the least worst option. So likewise, I'd say Western power, American power in your context, can be similarly described as the least worst option. And having written that, you've kind of articulated that. Where I'd say interests me to perhaps expand on a bit is this line: we can wring our hands and fantasize about a multipolar future that is unlikely to ever come. Now, this is where, like the Michigan example, I perhaps see the light reflects through my lens, that you share that lens in a slightly different way and land somewhere else. So I think that Trump has recognized the limits of American power, and in doing so has recognized that though he wants to champion it, and by the way, when I say Trump, I don't mean the individual, I mean the entire phenomenon that represents the man, has recognized that it's a good thing to defend these values and culture, B, where it hasn't been defended in the past, it should be called out. So that's where you see Trump calling out the neocons. He does it all the time, calling out the neocons in the past. And then C, recognizing that the limits of that. What are the limits of that? So where again, I think perhaps we diverge slightly is in your book. You've mentioned that China is not a rising state, but in fact in decline.
Right.
Not so much disagreeing with you on that. What I'm saying is actually rather than rising or declining, is it the case with what we saw recently in the Venezuela example uh, and the recollection of or the revival of the Monroe Doctrine, dubbed now the Donroe Doctrine? Is it the case that the American powers that be, foreign policy powers that be, especially in the geostrategic sense, have come to recognize that rather than sit at the precipice of World War III, fighting over the who gets to become the hegemony going forward, otherwise referred to as the Thucydides trap. Let's keep fighting China or keep fighting anyone else who is trying to knock us off the top spot, rather than that scenario, which unfortunately a danger of that is the Thucydides trap and the ignition of World War III, which would be the end, I'm sure you agree, of all of us. So rather than tempt that, is it the case that Trump and his people have instead decided that the world will be divided roughly into spheres? So China gets to dominate the Pacific region. America gets to dominate what's known as the Western Hemisphere, but really is the North and South Americas. And as a result of a rising, let's say, quote unquote, Muslim NATO, and I say that word advisedly because that's how someone known at social media are dubbing it, but more accurately a Middle Eastern NATO, because of course 20% of Egypt is Coptic Christian. That is the Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia post-Syria alliance defense pact indicative of a weakened Iran and a resurgent Sunni bloc in the Middle East? And will that also become a sphere of influence? And so what we're looking at is potentially 4 spheres of influence. The Monroe Doctrine applying to America, that's them guarding their own quote unquote backyard, and with all of the loaded reference there acknowledged.
Right.
But America guarding its own backyard, China taking over its backyard, the Pacific, the Sunni Muslim powers dealing with the Middle East. That's the nuclear power Pakistan with the NATO member Turkey, the Islamic leader Saudi Arabia, them getting to become a hegemony in the Middle East. You see in that context the Saudis fighting back against the Emiratis, fighting back against some of the Israeli foreign policy objectives in the area, and also fighting back against Iran. And then you have Russia and its sphere of influence. So those 4. And would that suggest perhaps, yes, a case for American power, but what are the limits of that power? The limits going forward could be some form of settlement that will each deal with our own backyard. So though we believe American power is worth fighting for, defending, and is the best, we won't try and impose it beyond this sphere of influence because we don't want World War III. So everything I've just described there, the reason I've gone into that, sorry for the lengthy thing, is because you've said we have no choice. We can wring our hands and fantasize about a multipolar future that is unlikely to ever come. If you get where I'm going with this, I think we actually are here already. I think we've got multipolarity. I think we're returning to it. And I think that's how we've avoided World War III. What's your comment on that, Shadi?
Yeah, great points. I would just say that the idea of this multipolar world, this multipolar future that you've just laid out, it makes me a little bit nervous. The idea of carving out spheres of influence, it's very 19th century, and maybe that's a good thing for some people, but I worry that it's a regression to a kind of world that we don't want to return to, a world that is more disconnected, more divided. America minds its own business in its own hemisphere, and then we let China do whatever it wants in its own sphere of influence in the Pacific. And that's obviously not a great outcome for Japan or Korea or Australia. Those are American allies that don't want to be left in the dust. And why if we think